He was born beneath skies that never quite settled into blue. As a child, Rick felt the air carried more than wind. It carried faint voices like fragments of lullabies that no one else seemed to hear. He would sit for hours by the window, head tilted, trying to catch every syllable of those whispers that slipped in between moments of silence. To others, he was simply a boy lost in daydreams. But to him, the world always had a secret lair, waiting patiently, asking nothing of him except attention. The house he grew up in was filled with ordinary clutter, broken clocks, chipped mugs, stacks of papers yellowed by time. Yet in Rick's hands, the ordinary never stayed ordinary for long. He would unscrew the backs of radios just to listen to the heartbeat inside them, tracing wires with small fingers, whispering encouragement as if the circuits could understand. He wasn't chasing invention. He was chasing companionship, filling the empty space between one heartbeat and the next with the hum of something alive, even if it was only a coil of copper or a spark of static. There was no rush in these explorations. Days stretched wide like warm afternoons where sunlight spilled lazily across the floorboards. Sometimes he would fall asleep beside the half-open casing of a toy, a screwdriver still resting in his palm. When he woke, he always found a kind of peace in the stillness, as if even sleep itself was part of his quiet experiments. The world might not notice such small acts, but he noticed and he remembered. He had no words then to explain why the stars seemed closer to him than to others. At night, lying on his back in the yard, he would see patterns no book had recorded, constellations bending into shapes that spoke to him alone. They reminded him of familiar things, an open door, a hand reaching out, the curve of a smile he had not yet met. The whispers came strongest then, soft and steady, like someone patiently reading a bedtime story just beyond the edge of the atmosphere. And yet, childhood is never without its shadows. There were nights when the voices grew faint, almost slipping away, and Rick feared they would never return. He would press his palms against the cool grass, grounding himself, holding on to the memory of their warmth. He did not know it then, but this fear of losing what could not be held would stay with him, shaping the man he would become. It was during one of those nights, when sleep would not come, that he noticed something unusual. A glimmer at the far end of the garden, just a flicker, quick as a sigh. He rose, bare feet brushing against the earth, and followed it. What he found was nothing more than a shimmer in the air, a distortion no larger than his own hand. But it pulsed gently, as if breathing, as if waiting. He leaned closer, heart steady, eyes wide with quiet wonder. That was the first time Rick realized the world was not entirely sealed. There were seams, thin and fragile, through which other places could be glimpsed. Not destinations for escape, but invitations to listen more carefully. He touched the air, felt it ripple, and though the shimmer faded, he knew something had changed. He knew, with the kind of certainty that only children can carry, that the whispers had shown him a doorway. And with that, the boy who once only listened began to learn how to answer. The shimmer he had touched lingered in his mind like the aftertaste of a dream. In the mornings that followed, Rick could think of little else. He carried the memory of that gentle pulse with him through every routine, when tightening the loose screws on an old radio, when walking the quiet path to school, when lying half awake at night with the hum of cicadas pressing against the window. It was as if a door had opened inside him, and even though the garden shimmer was gone, the space it left behind refused to close. He began experimenting without even realizing that's what he was doing. A jar of fireflies became his first model. He placed it near the same spot in the garden and spoke softly to them, not with commands, but with questions. Could they hear the whispers too? Could they sense the thin places in the air? The fireflies glowed with no answers, but Rick found comfort in watching their rhythm, imagining that they too were drawn to something larger than themselves. Soon, he started tinkering with scraps more deliberately, bits of metal, stray wires, a cracked lens he found in his father's workshop. He assembled them into small shapes that didn't have names, not toys, not tools, but something in between. He held them to the starlight, adjusted the angles, and sometimes, just sometimes, the air would waver, as though it remembered him. The shimmer never lasted more than a blink, but even a blink was enough. Each one whispered possibility. Rick kept these secrets guarded, not from shame, but from tenderness. They were too delicate to share with anyone else. The world around him moved with noise, teachers asking questions he didn't care to answer, neighbors gossiping in doorways, his parents caught in the grind of daily living. None of them would have understood the strange patience of listening to a silence that spoke, so he stored every moment in memory, like folded letters never sent. And yet, even solitude finds ways of reaching out. One evening, as he knelt in the grass, fitting a shard of glass to a bent coil, someone came near. It was his neighbor, a boy only a little older, carrying a half-broken lantern he hoped to fix. He watched Rick without speaking, curious, cautious. Rick expected him to laugh or tease, but instead the boy simply sat down and held out the lantern. The gesture was quiet, unassuming, yet it cracked open something inside Rick. For the first time, his strange experiments were not a burden, but a bridge. The two of them worked in silence. Rick's hands traced the lantern's broken frame, while the boy's eyes followed closely, respectful, almost reverent. When the lantern finally flickered back to life, it cast a glow over their faces, soft, golden, fragile. The boy smiled, and Rick realized that companionship didn't need words. It only needed presence. That night, when he returned to the garden alone, the shimmer appeared again, stronger this time, brighter, almost as if it approved. Rick touched it once more, and a warmth traveled through his fingers, not sharp, not frightening, simply welcoming. He sensed, deep in the marrow of his bones, that these experiments were not about building machines, but about opening himself. The seams in the world responded to kindness, to trust, to the tender way he carried loneliness and turned it into care. The whispers in the sky grew clearer, less like fragments, more like songs. He could almost make out the words, though they slipped away whenever he tried too hard to listen. From that night forward, he no longer thought of himself as a boy playing with scraps. He was a listener, learning to speak back. And though the garden looked unchanged to anyone else, to Rick it had become something sacred, a place where the thin air between worlds breathed with him, slow and steady, as if waiting for the boy to grow into what he was meant to become. The shimmer did not stay small forever. Night after night, Rick returned to the same patch of garden, his hands carrying whatever pieces of wire, glass, or gears he could find. What began as faint ripples in the air slowly stretched wider, like curtains stirring in a draught. At first, it was no larger than his palm, then the size of a book, and soon big enough to lean his head through if he dared. He never rushed it. He treated it as one treats a wild bird, gentle, patient, careful not to startle. The seam grew with him, as if answering to the rhythm of his own breath. The first time he saw beyond it, he thought he was still dreaming. A meadow bathed in violet light stretched endlessly on the other side, grass swaying without wind, stars lingering close enough to touch. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and the shimmer closed, leaving him standing in the garden with empty air. But the image clung to him. It wasn't imagination. He knew that in the marrow of his bones. It was real, and it was waiting. As days passed, the seam returned more willingly, as if it trusted him now. Each time it opened, Rick caught different glimpses. A river flowing with silver light, its surface rippling like polished glass. A forest where every leaf glowed faintly, as though storing memories. Once, only for a breath, he saw a doorway carved into stone, half buried and silent. These weren't destinations in the way adults might think of. No maps, no labels, no rules. They were invitations, fragile and luminous. He began sketching them in the margins of his notebooks at school. The teachers assumed he was daydreaming again, and perhaps he was, but each drawing was his way of holding on to what he had seen. In the quiet of his room, he would trace those sketches with his finger before sleep, whispering to himself that the seams were real, that the world was not limited to brick walls and ticking clocks. There were nights when the shimmer faltered, when it refused to appear no matter how patiently he waited. On those nights, he felt a hollow ache in his chest, as though something essential had slipped too far away. But the ache never lasted long. Inevitably the seam returned, often when he least expected it, while mending a broken toy or humming to himself beneath the stars. The seams seemed to appear not from force but from gentleness, as if the act of caring was what kept them alive. One evening the neighbour boy returned, lantern in hand, and asked without words if he could sit beside him again. Rick nodded, and together they watched the air bend. The boy didn't gasp or question. He simply leaned closer, eyes wide, trusting the moment without needing explanations. That silent companionship changed something in Rick. For the first time, he understood that these glimpses into other places were not meant to be hoarded. They were meant to be shared, tenderly, with those who could see without doubting. The shimmer grew stronger that night, stretching taller than both of them, glowing softly like a curtain of twilight. Rick did not step through. Not yet. He knew he wasn't ready, knew that some doors required more than curiosity to cross. Instead, he stood before it, feeling the gentle pull of its light, and made a quiet promise to himself. When the time was right, he would go. He would carry not just his own longing, but the weight of the moments that shaped him, the whispers, the silence, the trust of a friend sitting quietly in the grass. The seam pulsed once, as if it had heard him, and then faded back into the night. And though the garden fell into stillness again, Rick no longer felt alone. The stars hummed overhead, steady and low, and he knew he had taken the first step towards something vast. The journey would not be about conquering those places, but about learning what they meant, about discovering why the universe had chosen to show them to a boy who listened more than he spoke. The promise he made beneath the shimmer did not fade with the morning. It lingered in him like a steady rhythm, subtle but undeniable, shaping his thoughts even when his hands were busy with the ordinary tasks of life. Rick began to feel as though he lived in two worlds at once, one of kitchens, classrooms and voices calling his name, and another of quiet thresholds, half open and waiting, where the air itself leaned forward to listen. He moved between them gently, careful not to lose his footing in either, as though some unspoken balance depended on his patience. In the evenings, when the house fell silent and shadows pressed against the windows, he would slip back to the garden. The shimmer welcomed him with a familiar warmth, bending wider now, humming softly at the edges. Rick no longer treated it only as something to look at. He began testing its skin, brushing his hands against the glowing veil, noticing how it rippled in response to his touch. Each experiment was cautious, respectful, as though he knew that forcing it would only make it vanish. He would whisper small things into the light, phrases of comfort, fragments of wonder, and sometimes, though he could not explain how, he felt the words were carried through. One night, his fingertips pressed deeper than before. Instead of slipping away, the shimmer held him, cool and fluid, a sensation like dipping into water that wasn't wet. Rick's breath caught. He didn't withdraw this time. He leaned forward slowly until his hand disappeared beyond sight. For a heartbeat he feared he had lost it, that it had dissolved into nothing, but then he felt it brush against something impossibly real, the texture of grass, soft and swaying, though the wind in his own garden was still. He pulled back, heart steady but heavy with awe. The shimmer closed with a soft sigh, and Rick sat on the ground, cradling his hand, as if it had touched a secret too fragile to be spoken aloud. He didn't tell anyone, not even the boy who sometimes kept him company. This step, he sensed, was his alone to carry. He understood now that the seams weren't tricks of light. They were paths leading somewhere beyond the ordinary horizon. Days grew into weeks, and Rick's courage stretched with them. He learned how to coax the shimmer open with small adjustments to his makeshift devices, angling bits of glass to catch starlight, aligning scraps of metal so they hummed in harmony. The more he worked, the more the seams seemed to trust him, staying open longer, glowing brighter. He began to glimpse not just landscapes, but details, the ripple of water beneath moonlight, the bend of a branch under invisible weight, the faint echo of a song carried from far away. Still, he never rushed to cross. His instinct told him that these worlds were not prizes to seize, but lessons to absorb. He studied them like a student of silence, committing every glimpse to memory, sketching them by lamplight, whispering their shapes back into the night, as though rehearsing for the day he would finally step through. The garden had become a place of waiting, not passive but patient, a threshold that taught him something about himself. Rick realized that his gift was not just clever hands or restless curiosity. It was his ability to linger where others hurried, to listen where others turned away. He was learning, without anyone telling him, that the seams of the universe did not yield to brilliance alone. They yielded to care, to the way a boy could stand in the dark with open eyes and an open heart, unafraid of silence. And so, one evening when the shimmer swelled taller than ever before, a curtain wide enough to invite his whole body through, Rick stood before it and did not hesitate. He knew that the first true step was coming, not out of desperation but out of trust. The garden behind him was quiet, the stars above steady, and the seam in front of him glowed like a promise answered. He reached forward, not to conquer, not to escape, but simply to belong, and the air gave way. The first step was unlike anything Rick had known, though it did not roar or dazzle as he had half feared. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world itself had drawn in a breath to see what he would do. The air around him shifted, light bending in slow ripples, and then the garden was gone. He stood instead upon a meadow stretched beneath a violet sky, the grass rising in long, soft blades that swayed without wind. Each blade seemed faintly luminous, holding its own thread of light, so that the ground beneath him shimmered like a calm sea under starlight. He held himself still for a long time, his senses wide open. The air carried no familiar scents, no soil, no wood smoke, no grass he could name. It smelled instead of something clean and unmarked, like the first page of a book or the hush of a room never entered. He listened carefully, waiting for sound, but the silence here was layered, alive. It was not emptiness, it was presence, vast and gentle, watching him with patience. Rick bent down and brushed his hand across the glowing grass. It yielded softly, springing back as though delighted by his touch. For the first time, he felt the whispers in the stars, not as distant voices, but as a warmth travelling through the earth beneath his palm. He had not lost them. He had stepped closer. A quiet smile tugged at him. Small, hesitant, but real. He did not rush forward. He walked carefully, each step measured, his shoes leaving no trace behind him. The meadow stretched endlessly, but he did not feel lost. Instead, the expanse felt like an open hand, a welcome offered without words. At times, he caught sight of faint shapes moving at the edge of vision, flickers like lanterns swaying in the dark. He did not chase them. He only kept walking, and they seemed to follow, circling him in wide arcs, never threatening, only curious. As he walked further, he found a river. It was not like any river he had ever known. Its surface was silver, flowing slowly as though time itself had thickened. He crouched at its edge, watching his reflection bend and stretch. It did not match him perfectly. The boy in the water looked a little older, his eyes carrying a weight Rick did not yet recognize. He reached toward the reflection, fingertips grazing the silver surface, and ripples spread outward, carrying his image away. When it returned, the boy's face was his again, but softer, as though the river had decided to show mercy. Rick lingered there, his thoughts folding inward. The shimmer, the whispers, the garden, all of it had led to this quiet moment, where he realized the worlds beyond were not meant to overwhelm. They were meant to teach. The meadow taught patience, the river taught reflection. Even the silence carried its lesson, that to step into the unknown was not to demand answers, but to listen more deeply than ever before. He wanted to stay longer, to see how far the meadow stretched, or where the river carried its silver flow. But as he rose to his feet, the air behind him stirred. The shimmer quivered, still open, its glow tugging gently like a reminder. He understood then that these crossings would not last forever, that each visit was a gift given sparingly. He turned once more to take in the violet horizon, pressing the sight deep into his memory, before stepping back toward the light that would return him home. The garden met him with the chirp of crickets, the cool earth beneath his shoes, the stars steady overhead. And though nothing here had changed, Rick knew he was no longer the same boy who had knelt in the grass weeks before. He carried the meadow in his chest, the silver river in his veins, and the silence like a promise that would follow him through every seam he found. The nights that followed felt different, as if the garden itself had taken a breath and would never exhale again. Rick returned again and again to the place where the shimmer opened, each time with a steadier hand, each time staying just a little longer. He discovered quickly that the seams were not endless invitations. They pulsed with a rhythm of their own, opening when they wished, closing without warning, as if reminding him that he was still a guest in something larger than himself. He learned to wait patiently, watching the grass shift in the faint wind, until the light quivered once more. Crossing grew easier. The meadow of violet light greeted him with familiarity, and he began to notice its details, patterns in the swaying blades, shapes woven into the stars above, even the way the river bent, always curving toward a horizon he could never quite reach. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt something subtle tugging at him, a weight in his chest, like the pull of sleep after too many sleepless nights. The air grew heavier around his shoulders, his thoughts blurred at the edges. When he finally returned home, he would collapse on his bed, exhausted in a way no one could see. Rick started testing himself. At first he stayed for minutes, then for what felt like hours. He carried a small notebook and tried to mark the time, sketching the glowing trees, counting his breaths by the riverbank. Yet each attempt at measurement slipped away from him. When he returned, the stars in his own sky had shifted, sometimes by moments, sometimes by whole hours. He realized the seams didn't honor the rules of clocks. They ran by another kind of rhythm, one he hadn't yet learned to hear. The neighbor boy noticed the change. Rick grew pale, his eyes rimmed with shadows, his words drifting slower. One evening, the boy asked what he was hiding, voice soft as though afraid to push too hard. Rick hesitated, torn between the need to protect his secret and the weight of carrying it alone. Finally, he opened his palm and showed him the sketches, the meadows, the silver rivers, the strange glowing shapes. The boy studied them in silence, his face unreadable, then nodded as if to say he believed, though no proof had been given. That simple nod felt like a gift Rick hadn't known he needed. Together, they began waiting in the garden. Rick never let the boy cross. He wasn't sure if the seam would allow it, or if it would vanish the moment another body tried to pass through. Still, the boy stayed at his side, lantern flickering, a steady anchor. When Rick grew pale and swayed on his feet, it was the boy's hand that steadied him, pulling him back before the shimmer could close with him still inside. Rick came to understand something then, that every door, no matter how wondrous, asked for a price. The seams gave him glimpses of beauty beyond measure, but they also drew from him, quietly, like rivers drawing water from hidden springs. He was not being punished, only balanced. The universe seemed to whisper, to step further, you must learn not only how to cross, but how to endure. One night, after returning from a longer stay than ever before, Rick lay on his back in the grass, staring at the familiar stars above his own world. His chest rose and fell with a heaviness that felt almost tender, like a reminder rather than a warning. He realized then that his journey was no longer about what he could see beyond the seams, but about who he was becoming each time he returned. And as he closed his eyes, drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep, the whispers came again, clearer now, close enough to almost form words. The whispers no longer hovered at the edge of Rick's hearing. They began to thread themselves into something clearer, not quite language, but rhythm, like the cadence of a lullaby that carried meaning even without words. He would lie in the garden after each crossing, eyes half closed, and feel the hum in his chest, steady as a heartbeat not his own. At times, it rose into him like encouragement. At others, it pressed gently against his doubts, reminding him of the limits he could not yet pass. He began to understand that the seams were not merely places to enter, but teachers. Their silence and their song meant to shape the listener who was willing to stay. Rick carried this new awareness into his experiments. Instead of forcing the shimmer open with scraps and lenses, he tried moving in rhythm with the sounds he sensed. He would wait for the moment when the air seemed to lean toward him, then step forward, breathing in time with its unseen pulse. More often than not, the seam obeyed, not because he had compelled it, but because he had learned to meet it halfway. Each success filled him with a quiet wonder that was gentler than triumph, more like the relief of finally being understood. The journeys grew stranger as he listened more deeply. Once he walked into a grove of silver trees, whose branches bent low, humming softly when brushed. Another time he followed the violet meadow until it sloped into hills covered in pale flowers that opened and closed as though they breathed. But always the whispers followed, never intrusive, always guiding, nudging him to notice not the spectacle but the stillness within it. He began to sense that the worlds were mirrors, not prizes, that each shimmer showed him a reflection of some truth he had yet to name. The weight of staying too long remained, but he bore it differently now. Instead of fearing the exhaustion, he treated it as part of the lesson, a reminder that wonder was not endless, that every glimpse required him to return, to rest, to carry what he had learned back into the quiet patterns of ordinary life. The garden became his anchor more than ever, the place where he understood that journeys outward were also journeys inward, each seam folding him closer to himself. The neighbor boy noticed the change, though Rick rarely spoke of it. He saw it in the way Rick's eyes lingered longer on small things, the way lantern light curved around glass, the way silence settled after laughter. He saw it in the sketches too, which no longer seemed like attempts to capture the worlds but invitations to feel them. Sometimes, when the seam opened and Rick stood at its edge, the boy would place a hand on his shoulder, steady and wordless, as if reminding him that he wasn't walking this path alone. One evening, as Rick returned from the shimmer, pale but calm, the whispers stayed with him longer than before. For the first time, they did not fade into formless tones, but shaped themselves into something closer to words. The sound was faint, fragile as breath, but he heard it. A single phrase repeated slowly, as if the universe itself wanted to be sure he did not miss it. It said, not in his ears but in the marrow of him, "You are listening well." Rick sat in the grass, the stars steady above, and felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with pride. It was gentler than that, like the feeling of a door opening just enough to let in a sliver of light. He closed his eyes, knowing the path ahead was still hidden, but also knowing he was no longer wandering blind. For the first time, he understood that the seams were not leading him away from his life, but toward a purpose he had yet to discover, one whisper at a time. The phrase lingered in him for days, soft as breath, repeating itself in quiet spaces when he wasn't trying to hear. "You are listening well." Rick carried it like a secret melody, the kind that reshaped the rhythm of his thoughts without him noticing. At school, while numbers blurred across chalkboards and voices filled the room, he would hear it again, steady and patient, reminding him that the seams were not accidents but conversations, threads binding him to something unseen. The more he leaned into that awareness, the clearer the connection grew. When he opened a seam, the whispers no longer felt distant. They pressed closer, brushing the edges of his mind like the weight of a hand resting gently on his shoulder. Sometimes they hummed with approval when he lingered on a detail too easily overlooked, the bend of a flower toward hidden light, the silence between ripples in the silver river. Other times they pressed firmly against his impatience, reminding him to slow, to breathe, to remember that discovery was not measured by distance but by depth. One evening, as he stepped through into the violet meadow, the whispers carried a different weight. They did not drift around him like air, but seemed to flow through him, weaving him into the space itself. For a fleeting moment, he felt as though he was not a boy standing in a strange land, but part of the land itself, his heartbeat aligned with the rhythm of grass and sky. When the sensation passed, he staggered, dizzy not from exhaustion but from the intimacy of it, as if the world had reached out and embraced him. Rick returned to the garden with trembling hands, but his eyes shone. The neighbor boy saw the change and asked, voice hesitant, what he had felt. Rick searched for words but could only say, "It's like someone is waiting." The boy didn't press further, only nodded, lantern light catching in his eyes, as if he too believed without needing proof. The nights grew heavier with meaning after that. Rick began to sense that the whispers were not abstract lessons but pieces of a dialogue, fragments of something trying to bridge the divide. They guided him not toward answers but toward relationship, reminding him that listening itself was a form of belonging. The exhaustion he once feared became easier to bear, for he no longer felt drained alone. He felt accompanied, as though each step, each breath, was echoed by something vast that cared enough to speak. And yet, with each crossing, the pull grew stronger. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, an invitation that grew harder to resist, the call to step deeper, to move beyond meadows and rivers, to follow the connection to wherever it wished to lead. He knew that once he did, the seams might change forever, that he might find himself unable to return as easily. But the whispers never rushed him. They waited, patient, gentle, as if certain that he would come when he was ready. Rick lay in the garden one night, eyes tracing the constellations, and realized that the stars above no longer seemed entirely his own. They hummed faintly with the same rhythm as the voices, a reminder that the connection did not end at the seam. It was everywhere, hidden in silence, waiting in light. He breathed slowly, knowing the next step was coming. Not tomorrow, not tonight, but soon. The universe had spoken, and he had listened. Now it was time to answer. The pull deepened with every passing night, not sharp or demanding, but steady, like a tide drawing the shore into its rhythm. Rick felt it in the quiet moments, most of all, in the stillness before sleep, in the hush that followed laughter, in the pause between his own breaths. The seams no longer felt like thresholds to places unknown, but like invitations from someone waiting patiently just beyond his reach. He knew he could not linger on the edges forever. Sooner or later, he would have to follow the call. When the shimmer opened again, he stepped through without hesitation, his body moving as though guided by a certainty older than thought. The violet meadow welcomed him, Silver River glimmering in the distance, but this time the air carried something new. It vibrated faintly, not in sound but in presence, a quiet hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rick walked carefully, each step measured, until the meadow gave way to a grove of pale trees. Their branches swayed without wind, their leaves glowing faintly like lanterns. It was there that he felt it, the unmistakable sense of being seen. Not by eyes, not by a figure he could name, but by something vast and gentle, leaning close. The whispers rose around him, no longer scattered, no longer faint. They gathered, weaving together into a chorus that pressed against his heart more than his ears. He did not understand their language, not fully, but he understood their intent. You are not alone. Rick sank to his knees, overwhelmed not with fear but with a tenderness so strong it ached. He placed his hand on the ground and the soil thrummed in response, carrying warmth up through his arm. He whispered back, words spilling out without thought. Simple phrases, fragments of gratitude, questions too wide for language. The grove listened. He felt it in the way the branches leaned closer, in the way the air steadied around him, in the way the whispers softened, as though they were answering, not with words, but with presence. For the first time, Rick realized the seams were not only doors into new landscapes. They were threads of relationship, connections binding him to something that wanted to meet him halfway. The exhaustion he carried home from each crossing was no longer just a toll, but a reminder that he was carrying pieces of that presence with him, woven into his very being. When he returned to the garden that night, his body trembled with weariness, but his heart was quiet, sure. The neighbor boy found him lying in the grass, eyes half closed, and asked softly what he had seen. Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he reached out and took the boy's hand, pressing it gently to the earth. The ground hummed faintly beneath them, and though the boy could not hear the whispers as Rick did, he felt the warmth. That was enough. As the stars turned above them, Rick understood that the connection was not his alone to bear. It flowed outward, touching those who stood near him, reminding him that what waited beyond the veil was not only for him, but for anyone willing to listen. He closed his eyes, the whispers carrying him towards sleep, and knew the next time he stepped through he would not just be visiting, he would be answering the call in full. The night he returned to the grove, Rick felt the air shift before the shimmer even opened. It was as though the world itself leaned toward him, waiting. When the veil parted, he stepped through without hesitation, the meadow unfolding, the silver river glinting in the distance, and the grove glowing softly ahead. Each step carried the weight of inevitability, as though he had been moving toward this moment all along. The whispers rose as he entered the trees, no longer faint threads, but a steady current flowing through him. They did not speak in words, not truly, but in meaning, waves of warmth and quiet intent that filled his chest. He followed them deeper until the grove opened into a clearing. At its center stood something unlike anything he had seen before. Not a figure, not a shape, but a gathering of light, delicate as a flame, yet steady, its glow pulsing with the same rhythm as his heartbeat. Rick froze, breath shallow, not from fear but reverence. He sensed at once that this was the source, the presence that had watched him, whispered to him, guided his every careful step. It did not move toward him, nor did it demand. It simply waited, shining softly in the stillness, as if inviting him to decide whether he would come closer. He lowered himself to the ground, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the glow. The air between them vibrated faintly, each pulse carrying a sensation he could feel deep in his bones. The presence spoke, not in sentences, not in commands, but in impressions. He felt the weight of patience, the tenderness of welcome, the unspoken truth that he had been seen all along. For a moment, Rick thought he might dissolve into it entirely, his edges blurring, his heartbeat indistinguishable from the light, steady rhythm. He whispered again, this time without hesitation. Words of thanks, words of wonder, questions too wide to form. His voice trembled, yet the grove held it, carrying each syllable as though it belonged. The light shimmered in response, brighter for a breath, then gentler again, as if to say it had heard. That was enough, more than enough. Rick did not reach out. He knew this connection was not meant to be grasped. It was meant to be carried. When the light dimmed, folding back into the air, the whispers softened, fading into the steady hum of silence. He stayed kneeling long after it had gone, memorizing the warmth that lingered, committing it to memory the way one commits a lullaby to the heart. When he returned to the garden, he lay in the grass beside the neighbor boy, who had fallen asleep waiting for him. Rick stared at the stars, their faint glimmer no longer distant, and realized he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The seams were no longer just windows into other places. They were doorways into relationship, into a bond that asked him to grow, not in brilliance, but in gentleness. The boy stirred beside him, mumbling something in half-dream, and Rick turned his head toward him, smiling faintly. For the first time, he felt that the presence beyond the seams and the companionship beside him were not separate threads. They were part of the same fabric, weaving him into a story larger than he had ever imagined. The days that followed moved differently, as if the air of his ordinary world had learned to echo what he had seen in the grove. Rick noticed it first in the smallest of things, the way sunlight touched the rim of a glass, how the dust in the air spun in gentle spirals, how silence between two words felt alive rather than empty. The presence he had encountered beyond the seam did not vanish with the closing of the shimmer. It travelled with him, woven into the quiet folds of daily life, reminding him that the boundary between worlds was thinner than he had once believed. He began to act on it without realizing. When his mother's hands trembled carrying a stack of dishes, he reached to steady them, not out of obligation, but because the hum within him urged gentleness. When a teacher scolded him for drifting too far into his notebook, he lifted his gaze and offered a calm smile rather than shrinking in shame. Even his silences grew different. They were no longer retreats, but spaces he filled with presence, as though listening not only to whispers from the stars, but to the breaths and pauses of those around him. The neighbor boy saw the change most clearly. Where Rick once returned from the seams pale and weary, he now carried a steady calm, as though the light he had touched in the grove continued to breathe through him. Sometimes they would sit together without speaking, lantern flickering between them, and Rick felt the same sense of companionship he had known under the glowing trees. It was no longer a secret burden, but a bond that flowed outward, shaping the way he saw even the most ordinary nights. Still, the pull remained. The seams did not release him simply because he had carried something back. Each evening, when the stars appeared, he felt the familiar tide drawing him toward the shimmer. It no longer felt like temptation, but like responsibility, a reminder that the connection asked for more than gratitude. It asked for continuation, for a deepening. He knew the presence had shown itself not as an end, but as a beginning. One night, as he prepared to return, he lingered in the garden longer than usual, the boy at his side. Rick looked at him and whispered, "If I go further, I may not come back the same." The boy didn't flinch or try to stop him. He simply nodded, as if he had always known. That quiet trust settled into Rick's chest like an anchor, and when the shimmer opened, he stepped through with steadier breath than ever before. The meadow welcomed him, the river gleamed, the grove whispered, but Rick did not stop at the familiar. The presence tugged deeper, beyond them, clearing where the light had once pulsed. He followed, each step guided by the quiet rhythm he now carried within himself. And as he walked, the whispers no longer felt like distant guidance. They wove themselves into his very thoughts, not replacing them, but harmonizing with them, as if the voice he had always thought was his alone had never been entirely solitary. He understood then that the seam was not only showing him other places, it was showing him himself, what he could be if he allowed the bond to shape him, if he answered its call with the fullness of his life. And so he walked on, deeper into the unknown, knowing that with each step he was not leaving his world behind, but carrying both worlds within him. The deeper Rick walked into the seam's world, the more he felt its weight settle into him. At first it was subtle, like carrying a lantern that grew heavier the longer it stayed lit. His steps slowed, his breath grew shallow, yet he pressed forward, because the whispers urged him gently onward, never commanding, only reminding him that every journey required effort. He did not resist. He accepted the heaviness as part of the bond, a sign that the connection was not a dream but something real enough to ask something of him. The landscapes around him shifted in ways he had not seen before. The silver river curved into mist, fading into a wide expanse of stones that glowed faintly underfoot, each one pulsing with its own rhythm. Rick stepped carefully across them, feeling the vibration climb through his legs, steady and relentless. It was not painful, but it reminded him that the seam gave as much as it asked, that for every glimpse of beauty, something within him had to strengthen to carry it back. It was during this crossing that the first true challenge came. The whispers, once smooth and gentle, began to fracture, overlapping like voices speaking all at once. He froze, heart quickening, unable to tell if the dissonance was warning or invitation. The light in the stones brightened, then dimmed, flickering like uncertain breath. Rick closed his eyes, steadying himself, remembering what the presence had taught, to listen not with urgency, but with patience. Slowly, he filtered the noise until the chaos softened, resolving again into a single, steady hum. His body trembled, but his heart calmed. The seam had not turned against him. It was testing whether he could remain anchored when clarity gave way to confusion. When he finally returned to the garden, his exhaustion was sharper than before. He collapsed into the grass, chest heaving, the night sky spinning above him. The neighbor boy rushed to his side, lantern shaking in his hands, and pressed him to speak. Rick only managed a whisper. "It's heavier now." His friend said nothing, only sat close enough for their shoulders to touch, letting his presence be the answer. That quiet steadiness reminded Rick of what had carried him through, the truth that bonds were not kept by brilliance alone, but by trust and stillness shared. In the nights that followed, Rick entered the seams again and again, each time feeling the strain deepen, each time learning how to steady himself when the weight pressed hardest. His sketches grew rougher, less about capturing sights and more about capturing lessons, lines crossing, spirals overlapping, symbols of balance and endurance. He no longer sought to catalogue what he saw, but to remember how he had endured it. One evening, lying beneath the stars after a crossing, Rick realized that the bond was no longer something he simply visited. It had begun to shape him, slowly, like water shaping stone. His silences grew fuller, his words fewer but truer. Even when the shimmer was closed, he carried the presence in the rhythm of his own breath. The garden, once just a place of waiting, now felt like a reflection of the seam itself, alive, patient, holding him as he learned. The challenges were not there to break him. They were there to show him that listening was more than hearing. It was bearing weight, holding steady, carrying light even when it flickered. And though the strain left him weary, he found a quiet joy in it. For the first time he understood that redemption was not some distant victory. It was the slow, steady work of letting the bond change him, night after night, until he became the kind of person who could carry it with grace. Rick began to notice that the lessons of the seam did not stay confined to nights in the garden or the shimmering worlds beyond. They seeped into his days, quiet and steady, reshaping the way he moved through the familiar patterns of his life. Where once he drifted, half absent, sketching unseen places in the margins of notebooks, now he carried himself with a different kind of presence. He listened more deeply, not only to whispers from the stars, but to the pauses in conversation, the hesitations in voices, the silences that said more than words. At school, when classmates bickered over small things, Rick found himself watching instead of joining, feeling the rhythm beneath their anger. He began to notice how quickly heat flared and just as quickly cooled, like sparks dying in the dark. One afternoon, when two boys nearly came to blows, Rick stepped between them without force, his voice calm, his presence steady. The argument faltered, their anger dissolving into mutters, not because he had spoken something profound, but because he carried a weight that made the room quieter. The seam's bond had followed him into the daylight. At home, the changes were subtler. When his mother sighed into her hands after a long day, Rick lingered nearby, not pressing her with questions, not demanding her attention, but simply sitting in the same room. His silence was not empty. It was filled with the same patience the seam had shown him. Slowly, she lowered her hands, her shoulders softening as if the air itself had eased. She didn't thank him, didn't even notice perhaps, but Rick felt it. The bond was not meant for him alone. The neighbor boy saw it clearest of all. They still met in the garden at night, lantern glowing faintly between them, but Rick no longer seemed like a boy chasing strange lights. He seemed more like someone carrying them. When he spoke, it was with fewer words, but each one landed with quiet weight. The boy often said little in return, yet Rick could sense the difference. His presence steadied others, the way the whispers steadied him. Still, the pull of the seam did not relent. If anything, it grew more insistent, though never harsh. Rick knew he had not yet reached the heart of what waited. The presence in the grove had revealed itself, but the bond pressed him further, as if asking whether he would carry its rhythm not only in fleeting moments, but in every corner of his being. He felt both the invitation and the risk, the truth that the more he let it shape him, the more it would test him. One night, as he lay in the grass with a boy beside him, he admitted in a quiet voice, "It doesn't stop when the seam closes. It follows me. It changes how I breathe, how I listen, how I move." The boy, staring at the lantern light, whispered back, "Then maybe that's what it wants, for you to stop leaving it behind." The words struck him with the weight of truth. Rick realized then that his journey was no longer about slipping between worlds. It was about letting the seam's presence live through him, whether in a meadow of violet grass or a kitchen filled with ordinary silence. The thought carried both comfort and unease. Comfort because he understood at last that he was not chasing visions but becoming part of them. Unease because he sensed that every bond carried a deeper test, one he had not yet faced. The night stretched long, stars humming faintly above, and Rick knew the seam would soon ask him to prove whether he could hold its rhythm not only in moments of stillness, but in the storms yet to come. It began with a shimmer that didn't open. Rick stood in the garden as he always did, breath slow, hand steady, eyes on the place where the seam had so often appeared like breath upon the world. The air pulsed once, then stilled. He waited, tried again. The scraps he had once used to tune the shimmer hummed faintly but gave no answer. For the first time in what felt like forever, the seam refused him. Not with hostility, not with silence, but with absence, a gentle denial, like a door closing softly before a question could be asked. He didn't panic. He simply sat down. The grass was cool beneath him, the stars unchanged, the lantern behind him casting its familiar golden arc. The boy said nothing, only watched him carefully as though waiting to see if this moment would undo him. But Rick didn't break. He simply rested his palms on the earth and listened, not to find a seam, but to remember the rhythm that lived inside him. For days afterward he tried, again. The shimmer flickered once or twice, like an old friend hesitating at the edge of a goodbye, but it never opened. At school he was quieter than usual, not distant, but wrapped in thought. The presence had not left him, not truly. He still felt its hum when he closed his eyes, but it had withdrawn from the veil. Or perhaps, more truthfully, it had stepped back to see if he could walk without being led. Then came the moment that truly tested him. His mother, who had always moved through her days with quiet endurance, fell ill. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a slowing, a heaviness that settled into her bones and refused to lift. Rick watched her fade quietly, the light behind her eyes dimming in ways only he seemed to notice. Doctors gave names, prescriptions, time frames, but nothing they said touched the ache Rick felt building in his chest. He wanted to flee. Not out of fear, but out of longing. For the seam, for the quiet meadows and the warm silence, for the soft pulse of understanding that waited beyond language. But the doorway stayed closed, and he understood then that this was the storm. Not a blaze of light, not a collapse of stars, just the steady, aching demand to remain, to stay when staying was hard, to carry the bond where it hurt. At night, he sat beside his mother's bed, fingers tracing the fabric of her blanket as though it were a map. He spoke softly, words not for comfort, but for presence. He told her about the meadow once, about the silver river and the light that spoke in hums instead of sounds. She didn't respond, but her hand moved slightly in his, and in that quiet movement, Rick felt the bond pulse again. Faint, but alive. He had thought the seam was something he stepped into, but now he saw it differently. The seam was in him, in the way he listened, in the way he stayed, in the way he loved even when no light answered. The neighbor boy came by one evening bringing a new lantern. "Yours is dim," he said, placing it beside the older one without waiting for thanks. They sat side by side in the dark, and Rick, for the first time in days, felt the seam flicker, not in the garden, but inside him. It didn't open, but it hummed warm and real, as if to say, "You're exactly where you're meant to be." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He only closed his eyes and breathed in the dark, the weight of the storm pressing against him, and let the bond guide him through it, not with escape, but with stillness. Grief didn't arrive like a wave, not for Rick. It came like mist, thin, steady, and everywhere at once. It crept into mornings when he poured tea into his mother's empty cup. It hung in the quiet click of a door no longer opened. It sat in the garden beside him, heavy but shapeless, like a presence that refused to speak. She had slipped away with a breath so soft it barely stirred the room, and Rick, for all his connection to other worlds, could not follow. The seam did not open that night, nor the one after, and still he returned, lantern in hand, the neighbor boy beside him, the garden patient in its silence. Rick didn't wait for light anymore. He sat because he needed to remember how to sit, to be still, to feel the world without trying to bend it. He spoke to the ground more than he spoke to people. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes just breath. He told the grass things he could not yet name, how her laugh lived in the corners of the house, how he kept forgetting and then remembering all over again, how absence wasn't hollow but loud, the kind of loud that made everything else feel too quiet. It was a week, maybe more, before the shimmer stirred, not in the garden, not in the sky, but behind his eyes, in that strange hush between waking and sleep. He wasn't dreaming, not fully. He felt the pillow beneath his cheek, the warmth of the blanket still on his legs. But something else pulsed there too. A soft glimmer, not of light, but of memory carried forward. He saw the meadow again, distant, blurred as if viewed through water. The silver river bent gently toward him, but it did not call. It waited. No voices rose, no whispers guided him. And yet he felt her. Not her face or form, but the quiet shape of her presence, the particular stillness she had always carried into a room. It pulsed there, warm and constant, not returned to him, but reflected, echoed through the rhythm he now knew by heart. Rick didn't try to reach for it. He only breathed. Let it be. Let it wrap around him without touching. He understood then that the seam, in its own strange way, had prepared him for this, not to undo loss, but to endure it, to feel everything and still remain whole. He hadn't lost her completely. He had become something through knowing her, through listening, through staying, through loving her quietly in the dark. When he woke, there were tears on his face, not sharp, not sudden, just there, soft, like dew. The garden greeted him as it always did, unchanged and forgiving. The neighbour boy didn't ask what had happened, only handed him a folded scrap of paper. Rick opened it slowly. Inside was a drawing, not of the seam or the shimmer or even the meadow, just a cup of tea drawn carefully in graphite, steam curling up like breath. Rick smiled, a curve that didn't reach wide but ran deep. He pressed the paper to his chest and closed his eyes. The seam had never needed to open for this. It had already done its work. It had taught him to carry presence where nothing else could follow, to love without needing to hold, to hear silence and understand what it meant. He breathed in, and in the breath he heard her again, not her voice, but the shape of her calm, and he whispered back as the garden listened, "I'm still here, and I'm still listening." Rick didn't speak of it, not the shimmer behind his eyes, not the warmth he'd felt in the shape of silence, not even the tears that had come without asking. Permission. Some things, he had learned, were too sacred for language. Instead, he carried the stillness like a stone cupped gently in his hands. Not a burden, not a secret, just something that was his, that hummed quietly and asked nothing except to be held. Life resumed its quiet rhythm. The days returned, slow and uneventful. School halls humming with their usual noise, the house holding its empty spaces like familiar furniture. But Rick noticed something different in the way he moved through it all. Not grand, not sharp, just a subtle softening. He met people's eyes a little longer. He waited before speaking. When someone dropped something, he was already bending to pick it up. He didn't try to fix anyone's pain. He only stayed, the way he'd stayed in the garden, the way the seam had taught him to stay. And soon, people began to lean toward him in ways they hadn't before. A girl who rarely spoke sat beside him at lunch and said nothing for a long time, just shared the space. A teacher paused after class, not to reprimand, but to ask if he was doing all right. A younger student handed him a torn notebook and asked if he could help fix the spine. It was as if the presence he had once found beyond the seam was now brushing the edges of others through him. He didn't understand it at first, but one afternoon, while watching the neighbour boy thread a new wick into the lantern, it came to him. Grief, if carried with care, could open seams in other people. Not the shimmering kind that led to other worlds, but quiet ones, small and unnoticed, where pain waited patiently behind eyes and gestures, waiting for someone gentle enough to reach through. He had always thought of seams as rare, otherworldly things. Now he began to wonder if they were everywhere, between words, between breaths, between people sitting quietly together with nothing to prove. He found himself drawn more and more to these subtle spaces, not to heal them, not to own them, but to witness them, to keep them company. When the shimmer in the garden returned, faint at first, but real, he didn't run toward it. He sat with it like an old friend listening, and for the first time it did not ask him to cross. It simply pulsed there, beside him, the way his mother's breathing used to fill a room even when she said nothing at all. That night, Rick opened one of his old notebooks and began a new page. Not a sketch of a meadow, not a map of another world, but a list of small seams he'd seen that week. A glance between two strangers, a laugh that turned suddenly into tears, a boy waiting alone at the end of a hallway. He wrote them all down gently, as if naming them made them real, as if holding them with care could keep them from closing. When he finished, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady, as though some deeper part of him, once fractured by loss, had grown roots instead of scars. The shimmer faded slowly beside him, not vanishing, just resting. And Rick understood, in the quiet that followed, that he was no longer just a listener. He was part of the whisper itself now, moving, breathing, learning how to hum gently in the cracks where others had forgotten how to hear. It was a late afternoon in winter when the seam returned without invitation. Rick hadn't called for it, hadn't even been thinking of the shimmer. He was simply walking home from school, scarf loose around his neck, cold air prickling the back of his hands. The sky hung low, slate-coloured and heavy, and the world seemed to have tucked itself in early. He passed a narrow alley he'd walked by 100 times before, but this time something was different. The air felt thin, not cold, but light, like breath just before a whisper. He paused, turned, and there it was, faint as memory. A shimmer, tucked between the brick walls, so subtle it might have been mistaken for a trick of the dusk. But Rick knew better. He didn't approach. He only stood, watching it ripple faintly, not opening, not calling. It felt hesitant, as though it wasn't waiting for him. It was waiting for someone else. That night, he returned to the garden and wrote about it, not with urgency, but with careful thought. He had always known the seams responded to listening, but this was the first time he had sensed a shimmer waiting for someone else to be heard. It unsettled him, not in a frightening way, but in the way a familiar song sounds different when sung in another voice. The next day, Rick passed the alley again. This time, he wasn't alone. Ahead of him walked a classmate, Elia, a boy who always seemed to carry too much silence for someone his age. He never sat near anyone, never spoke unless called upon. There was a weight to the way he moved, like he was always half bracing for a storm no one else could see. Elia paused at the alley's mouth, not to turn in, just to look. His hand tightened around the strap of his bag. Rick felt something stir in his chest, not pity, recognition. He stepped forward, slow and quiet. "It's there, isn't it?" he said softly. Elia didn't answer right away. Then, almost without moving, he whispered, "I thought it was just me." Rick nodded. "It's not." They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, as the shimmer pulsed once, faint and real. Rick didn't tell Elia what to do. He didn't explain what the shimmer was or what it wanted. He had learned long ago that the seam didn't respond to explanation. It responded to readiness. Elia took a breath like he was about to step forward, then stopped. "I don't think I can." "You don't have to," Rick said. "Not yet." But he stayed beside him anyway. And when Elia turned away and walked on, Rick didn't follow. He stayed at the mouth of the alley until the shimmer faded, not disappearing, just resting, waiting for the moment Elia might return. That night, Rick felt the presence hum in him again, not like a call, but like approval. Not because he had crossed, but because he had waited, because he had chosen not to lead, but to remain present. He finally understood that the bond was no longer about what he could reach, or even what he could carry. It was about what he could hold open for others. He closed his notebook with steady hands and looked out at the stars. They were distant as ever, but somehow warmer now, like lights left on in windows for someone still walking home. Elia didn't mention the shimmer again. Not the next day, nor the one after. In class, he sat where he always had, shoulders drawn in, face unreadable. But Rick noticed something different now. A glance that lingered on the edge of windows, the way Elia's fingers tapped out quiet rhythms across his notebook, as though trying to measure something too subtle for language. The silence around him no longer felt like retreat. It felt like listening. Rick didn't press. He knew better. The shimmer had shown him that understanding couldn't be rushed, that readiness ripened in silence. Instead, he found small ways to stay near, an extra pencil offered without comment, a seat left open without expectation. When their paths crossed, Rick nodded gently, and Elia always nodded back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A week passed before it happened again. Another pause, this time outside the school gate, where the wind caught in the branches and the sky hung low with winter clouds. Rick felt the air shift before he even looked up. The seam was there again, faint and tucked between the spaces of the ordinary. Elia saw it too. Rick could tell by the way he stopped mid-step, his hand gripping his backpack strap as if bracing for something invisible. Still, he didn't approach. Not that day. But the next, he stayed behind after class, waited until the others had left. Rick remained at his desk, pretending to rewrite a sentence that didn't need fixing. Elia walked over without looking at him, placed a small paper scrap on the table, and turned to leave. No words. Rick unfolded it after he was gone. It was a drawing, just lines, quick but careful. A shimmer between two buildings, and beside it, a boy standing very still, alone, but not afraid. Rick folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He said nothing. That night he walked the garden alone and found no shimmer waiting for him, but he didn't need one. The presence hummed low in his chest, a steady confirmation. It wasn't his journey now. Not entirely. His role had shifted, not to lead, not to guide, but to hold space. To be what the seam had once been for him, a quiet place where someone else could begin to listen. Days blurred, winter deepened. The shimmer came and went without rhythm, and each time Elia noticed it, he stood closer to it than before. Rick never asked what he felt. He didn't need to. He could see it in the stillness that settled over Elia's posture, in the way his breath changed when the seam was near. Then one evening, under the grey gold of a setting sun, Elia finally stepped forward. Not through it, just to it. Rick watched from across the street. Elia placed his hand into the shimmer, the way Rick once had when he was still small and trembling. The light rippled faintly, soft and welcoming. Elia didn't cross. He just stood there, hand resting in the pulse of another world, eyes closed. Then, after a long moment, he stepped back. He didn't look around. He didn't say a word. But the next day he sat beside Rick during lunch. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And that night, when Rick returned to the garden, the seam greeted him again. Not as a call to enter, but as a thank you. A pulse of light in the shape of acknowledgement. He had once crossed into other worlds to be seen. Now he had stayed behind so someone else could begin to see. The shimmer, it seemed, had always been about more than him. The seam pulsed faintly that night, subtle enough that someone unaware might have thought the garden merely breathed. Rick stood at its edge, lantern at his side, feeling the same quiet rhythm he had known for months, only now it was different. He understood it more fully. The shimmer was not only a gateway to other landscapes, it was a mirror of choice, a reflection of what he could carry into the world, inside himself and through others. He traced the outline of the shimmer with a fingertip, feeling it respond like a living thing, quivering softly where his skin met the air. The presence was patient, waiting for him to decide what mattered, to step across once more, or to remain here, letting the lessons he had carried shape not only his own life but those around him. Rick thought of Elia, of the boy's quiet courage, of the trust that had grown between them. He thought of the meadow, the silver river, the grove of pale trees, and how each had taught him that listening was not a skill of the mind alone, but of the heart. He understood now that the shimmer would always exist, but it was he who had to choose whether to enter it or to nurture its reflection in the world he could touch. He knelt in the grass, hands brushing softly over the cold earth. In the quiet, the shimmer pulsed once more, a gentle acknowledgement. He could feel it in the rhythm of his chest, in the steady warmth under his palms. The choice was his, but it was not about fear or hesitation or even the thrill of discovery. It was about presence, about staying steady when the world demanded movement, about holding light in moments when it seemed there was none. Rick closed his eyes and breathed, counting the pulse of the shimmer, the rhythm of the stars, the weight of all he had carried. When he opened them, he saw the neighbor boy sitting silently behind him, eyes wide, lantern faintly glowing. Rick smiled, a soft, patient curve. He did not need to speak. The shimmer waited, and he waited too, And in that stillness, he understood something new. The seam was not the end of a journey. It was a constant invitation to step forward or to remain, or to guide another's steps without crossing at all. The choice was not about worlds, but about what he would carry forward: patience, presence, and the quiet courage to stay. Rick let the shimmer pulse against his palm, then released it. He rose slowly, the lantern light steady beside him. Together, he and the boy walked through the garden, leaving the seam where it belonged, not as a doorway, but as a quiet reminder. He understood now that this was the rhythm he had been preparing for all along. The bond, the whispers, the light, they were not lessons to master, but life to hold, patiently, gently, and with care. And somewhere beyond the shimmer, beyond the grove, beyond all the worlds he had glimpsed, that presence waited, not to command, but to witness. Rick began to see the world differently, not because it had changed, but because he had. The shimmer no longer dominated his attention. It had become a rhythm within him, a quiet pulse guiding his steps through ordinary days. He noticed small spaces that needed care, the way a chair might wobble, how a neighbor's window remained dark for too long, the way a child lingered too long in silence. He didn't rush. He didn't fix everything. He only held presence, the same steady attention the seam had shown him, and the world shifted around him in subtle ways. Elia began to mirror this rhythm, moving a little more openly through his own silences. Rick did not instruct him. He simply remained nearby, offering warmth where it was needed, listening without interruption. Together, they shared spaces in quiet harmony, waiting, watching, letting each moment unfold fully. The shimmer's lesson had been patience. Now it lived in their actions. Rick started to carry the same approach into school, noticing the unspoken needs of those around him. He passed a note to a classmate who always sat alone, lending small encouragement. He adjusted a teacher's chair when it wobbled, leaving it more stable than before. These acts were tiny, almost invisible, but they carried weight. He realized the bond he had nurtured with the shimmer was not about grandeur. It was about subtle presence, and its impact could ripple quietly, invisibly, through countless lives. At home, Rick applied the same care. He listened to the quietest hints of his family's moods, allowed space for grief, laughter, or exhaustion without trying to fill it. The presence of the shimmer no longer demanded physical crossing. It had become a template for being. He carried it into meals, conversations, and shared silences, and he found that the warmth it imparted extended naturally to others. One evening, the shimmer appeared faintly in his room, no more than a glow against the wall, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Rick did not reach for it. He simply sat, feeling its rhythm, letting it blend with the rhythms of the people he cared for, of the spaces he inhabited, and of the world beyond the garden. He realized that the bond had never been about escape. It had been about integration. Presence, patience, and quiet courage were now inseparable from his being. The neighbor boy stayed with him that night, lantern flickering, neither speaking. Rick understood that sometimes guidance was not about leading, but about waiting, about being steady enough to let someone else find their own path. The shimmer pulsed once more, soft and approving, and Rick allowed himself a quiet smile. He breathed deeply, exhaling into the night, and felt the world settle around him. Not perfect, not resolved, but alive, vibrant in its small rhythms, and in that, complete. The shimmer's lessons were not over. They never ended, but they no longer demanded frantic attention. They were part of him now, quietly shaping how he listened, how he stayed, and how he loved without possession. Rick spent the following days moving with a new awareness, a subtle clarity in every gesture and thought. The shimmer's lessons no longer lived only in the garden or the fleeting worlds beyond. They had settled into the way he carried himself through the ordinary hours. He noticed details he once overlooked, the way a shadow lingered too long in a corner, the uneven rhythm of a neighbor's steps, the sighs that preceded words in a classroom. These small observations were not burdens, but threads, each one an opportunity to weave quiet care into the spaces around him. He began leaving traces of patience wherever he went, a notebook left open with kind reminders, a hand held briefly over someone trembling, a word spoken softly when others expected command or criticism. Even Elia began to notice the change, sometimes mimicking the calm steadiness, sometimes watching silently, absorbing the rhythm without prompting. Rick realized that the shimmer had not only taught him to listen, but to shape space for others, to extend the same gentle attention that had once been given to him. At home, the lessons took on a different weight. Each interaction became deliberate in its quietness. Rick allowed silence to linger at the table, let gestures speak where words could not. Even when grief pressed heavily into the house, he discovered that being present, steady, and gentle could carry more meaning than explanations or reassurances. Presence itself, he understood, was a form of love. The shimmer pulsed faintly in his mind during these days, a soft rhythm echoing beneath his skin. He did not need to step into it physically. Its guidance had transformed into a quiet pulse that informed his choices, a constant, gentle awareness that shaped his actions with subtle precision. He found that his life, once punctuated by longing and unanswered questions, had begun to settle into a harmony he hadn't imagined possible. One evening, as he returned to the garden, lantern in hand, he paused at the familiar edge of the seam. It was faint, almost translucent, yet it seemed to breathe in sync with him. Rick knelt, brushing his fingers across the grass, feeling the pulse of connection both within and beyond. The neighbor boy sat beside him, quiet and steady, and Rick understood the unspoken truth. The shimmer had become more than a doorway. It had become a mirror. The light it offered was reflected through his own choices, his own presence, and the ways he allowed others to step forward. Rick breathed deeply, letting the weight of all he had carried settle into a gentle exhale. The shimmer pulsed once more, then softened, as if acknowledging not the boy who had once stepped through, but the person who had learned to carry its essence into the world. In that quiet acknowledgement, Rick felt a measure of completion, not an ending, but a transformation. He had learned to listen, to stay, to hold light without grasping, and to guide gently without intrusion. The stars above hummed faintly, steady and eternal, and Rick smiled. For the first time, he felt that his journey had become more than a series of crossings. It had become a life threaded with presence, patience, and quiet courage. And somewhere beyond the shimmer, beyond the garden, the bond he had nurtured waited, ever patient, ever constant, a whisper of light in the shape of living. Rick spent the early hours of dawn sitting quietly in the garden, the sky still painted in soft shades of violet and silver. The shimmer no longer pulsed sharply at the edge of the grass. It hummed faintly in rhythm with his own heartbeat, as though waiting not for him to cross, but to reflect. He thought of all the crossings he had made, all the lessons carried, and all the presence he had nurtured, not just within himself, but through his patience and care for others. The bond was no longer an object of curiosity or wonder. It had become a living rhythm threaded into the quiet of his life. He watched Elia approach, not with hesitation, but with the slow confidence of someone beginning to understand that presence could be gentle and sustaining. Together they sat in the quiet, letting the garden speak through its own hums and rustling leaves. Rick realized that the shimmer had given him more than glimpses of other worlds. It had given him the understanding of continuity, the way small, consistent attention could shape hearts, spaces, and even grief into something bearable, even luminous. At home, Rick carried the same awareness into his interactions. Every gesture, every pause, every unspoken acknowledgement became deliberate. When his family spoke of absence, he didn't try to fill the silence with words. He offered steadiness, a patient listening that allowed presence itself to heal. And in moments when friends or classmates faltered, when they seemed to teeter on the edge of unspoken fear or loneliness, Rick found he could create quiet spaces for them too, allowing the rhythm of calm and gentle attention to guide them toward balance. The shimmer had once been a doorway. Now it existed as a metaphor he could live by, a measure of what it meant to hold light without seeking to possess it. Each crossing, each lesson, each bond had taught him that the value of presence could not be quantified. It could only be offered, sustained, and witnessed. Rick understood that this was the final lesson of the seam, not the thrill of discovery, nor the excitement of unknown landscapes, but the steady, enduring act of simply being consistently for those who needed it. The neighbor boy came to sit beside him once more, lantern flickering faintly. They didn't speak, for no words were needed. Rick felt the shimmer's pulse beneath his awareness, soft and steady, and recognized that it had always been there, not to guide him, but to teach him how to carry its lessons into the world. He felt the entirety of his journey crystallize into quiet comprehension, that listening, patience, presence, and gentle guidance were the true crossings, the real pathways across the landscapes of life. Rick rose slowly, stretching, letting the air fill his lungs fully, and for the first time he felt unhurried. The garden, the shimmer, the stars, and even the memory of every meadow and silver river beyond it were folded into him, present not as distant wonders, but as threads woven into his living. He walked home with steady steps, knowing that the bond he had nurtured was not confined to spaces between worlds. It lived in each act of care, in every patient gesture, and in the soft, enduring pulse of presence he could carry anywhere. Rick returned to the garden one final time before the shimmer would rest for longer than usual. The air was still, the grass silvered faintly by the early morning light, and the hush of the world seemed to pause with him. He knelt at the edge where the shimmer had first appeared, fingers brushing lightly against the faint pulse that had accompanied him through countless nights. It no longer called urgently, nor did it flicker with hesitation. It simply waited, steady and quiet, reflecting the patience Rick had carried inside himself all along. He thought of all the crossings, all the moments of listening and presence, all the times he had chosen to stay when he could have run. He realized that the shimmer had never been a portal to escape or adventure. It had been a teacher, a mirror, and a companion. Its greatest lessons were not the meadows or silver rivers, but the weight and care of holding light for someone else and for himself. Every act of attention, every patient pause, every silent acknowledgement of another's presence had been a crossing as real and transformative as stepping through the veil. Elia joined him quietly, lantern in hand, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer. No words passed between them. None were needed. Rick understood that presence was now enough, that the bond had extended beyond thresholds and landscapes into the spaces of shared understanding. They simply sat, breathing with the rhythm of the garden, of the shimmer, of the quiet pulse threading them both. Rick traced the edges of the seam with his gaze, committing the memory to himself. He understood that he would not need to return to cross in the same way again. The shimmer's lessons had been internalized. He had learned to carry its rhythm wherever he went, in his gestures, his listening, his care. Even when the shimmer was absent, it lived through the patient attention he gave to the world and to those who shared it with him. As dawn brightened the horizon, the garden exhaled with the soft rustle of grass and leaves. Rick rose, feeling the weight of the journey settle into a calm strength. The neighbor boy mirrored him, and together they walked through the garden, not toward the shimmer, but through it, in understanding, presence, and quiet companionship. Each step was measured, intentional, and tender, echoing the rhythm that had been taught to him, now flowing outward. Rick paused, taking a final look at the shimmer. It did not vanish. It pulsed faintly, a whisper of what had been, a promise of what could still be. He felt gratitude, not for a door or a world, but for the quiet work of listening, patience, and care that had reshaped him into someone able to carry it all gently forward. He understood that the true crossing had always been within, and that the legacy of the shimmer was not in the places he had seen, but in the ways he could hold presence wherever he chose to walk. Rick walked slowly through the garden, the lantern in his hand swaying gently with each step. The shimmer pulsed faintly at the edge of the grass, steady but quiet, as if it, too, was preparing for rest. He thought of all the nights he had spent here, the hesitant first steps, the stretches into violet meadows, the silver rivers and glowing groves. But most of all, he thought of the patience he had learned. The shimmer had not been a teacher in the ordinary sense. It had been a companion, present in quiet, subtle ways that required endurance, awareness, and care. He knelt beside a small patch of grass, tracing its blades with a fingertip. Each one seemed to hold memory, vibrating softly beneath his touch. He thought of his mother, of Elia, of every small connection he had nurtured, and he understood that these threads, these moments of presence, were the true gifts of the shimmer. Not the sights, not the crossings, not even the otherworldly pulses, but the patience to carry light gently, steadily, through the spaces of life that often went unnoticed. Elia joined him at his side, and for a long while they sat quietly, letting the garden hum around them. Words were unnecessary. Rick felt the shimmer pulse faintly in rhythm with their breathing, and in that alignment he recognized the essence of all the lessons he had learned. Presence is a practice, listening is a gift, and care, quiet, patient care, is the way to cross into understanding without leaving anyone behind. The dawn began to break. Across the horizon, soft gold spilling into the sky, and Rick felt a completeness he had never known in any of the shimmering worlds he had visited. The shimmer's pulse had shifted subtly, as if acknowledging that the work it had asked of him was now fully internalized. He did not need to step through it again to understand its lessons. The shimmer lived in him now, in the rhythm of his heart, in the steadiness of his gaze, in the deliberate calm with which he moved through the world. Rick rose slowly, the neighbor boy beside him, and they walked back toward the house. Each step felt measured, intentional, and infused with quiet confidence. He understood that the shimmer had never been about adventure or escape. It had been about teaching him to carry presence, to hold the weight of others' quiet worlds with care, to endure, and to love gently without possession. The legacy of the shimmer was not a place to return to, it was a life to live. Rick paused at the gate, looking back at the faint glow that would rest, until next it chose to pulse. He let a small smile form, knowing the shimmer had given him far more than glimpses of other worlds. It had given him the capacity to inhabit this one fully, tenderly, and attentively. And as he stepped through the gate, the morning air brushing his cheeks, he felt the full weight and grace of everything he had learned. Presence, patience, listening, and the quiet courage to stay. Rick walked through the quiet streets as the first light of morning spilled across rooftops, softening the edges of the world. The shimmer no longer pulsed at the garden's edge, but its rhythm lived inside him, steady and unwavering. He thought of every crossing, every lesson carried, every silent presence he had held alongside his own. The journeys through violet meadows, silver rivers, and pale glowing groves were no longer destinations. They were threads, now woven seamlessly into the fabric of his life. He paused by a familiar bench, the neighbor boy standing quietly beside him. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary here. The weight of presence was enough. Rick understood fully that the shimmer had been less about adventure and more about teaching him to carry light gently, to sustain connection, to endure patiently, and to be steady when the world demanded it most. He had learned to hold the balance between movement and stillness, listening and acting, waiting and guiding. The city stirred around them, the mundane rhythms of daily life resuming with soft persistence. And yet for Rick, nothing was ordinary anymore. He noticed the subtle shifts, the way shadows bent across the pavement, the way a neighbor lingered in a doorway, the way distant laughter trembled in quiet moments. These small currents were no longer overlooked. They were part of the map he now navigated, a world enriched by the lessons of the shimmer, extended into every gesture, every glance, every act of quiet care. Rick breathed deeply, letting the morning air fill him. He felt the pulse of the shimmer in his chest, steady and soft, as if the light itself had chosen to rest there permanently. He realized then that the crossings, the whispers, and the otherworldly landscapes had been preparing him for this, the ability to carry presence everywhere, to shape moments through patience, listening, and gentle attention, to leave quiet ripples in hearts and spaces that might otherwise go unnoticed. He glanced at the neighbor boy, who smiled faintly, understanding reflected without words. Together they walked, each step measured, intentional, infused with the quiet courage of someone who had learned to hold light without grasping it. The garden, the meadows, the rivers, and the shimmer were no longer destinations. They were mirrors of the life he now carried. Presence itself was the journey, and it flowed through him into every place he touched. Rick stopped briefly, looking up at the vast sky. The stars had faded with dawn, but their hum lingered in his awareness, steady and calm. He understood, fully and finally, that the shimmer had taught him not only to listen, but to endure, to care, and to carry light quietly, steadily, with patience and tenderness. The lessons were complete, not as endings, but as a living rhythm he could extend into the world. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath settle all around him. The world felt fuller, quieter, brighter, not because anything had changed, but because he had changed within it, and somewhere the shimmer pulsed faintly, not calling him, not demanding, simply resting in the knowledge that its lessons had taken root. Rick smiled softly, feeling the entirety of the journey fold into this moment. Presence, patience, listening, and quiet courage threading through him and into the spaces of life. He turned toward home, the neighbor boy beside him, and walked slowly, each step a gentle echo of all he had learned. And in that quiet, Rick knew that the shimmer would always be part of him, not as a door, but as a pulse of light in the way he chose to inhabit the world. And somewhere he's still out there, napping in the sun. Even after the shimmer had settled, even after the lessons of the garden and the meadows had folded into his daily life, Rick sometimes returned to the quiet moments that first taught him to listen. He would walk slowly through streets that had once seemed mundane, noticing how light lingered in corners, how the wind carried whispers of movement, how the small pauses in conversation held weight. The rhythm of the shimmer now lived inside him, steady and patient, guiding him through each ordinary day with subtle insistence. He found that presence, once nurtured, could extend beyond a single moment or place. A classmate who hesitated at the edge of a playground suddenly smiled when Rick quietly offered a hand. A neighbor lingering on a doorstep felt the ease of his calm, a brief warmth rippling outward in ways unspoken but deeply felt. Rick realized that the shimmer's lessons were no longer about landscapes or light. They were about continuity, about carrying patience and care into spaces that might otherwise pass unnoticed. Sometimes, when he returned to the garden in the quiet hours of dusk, he would feel the pulse of the shimmer faintly at the edge of his awareness. It did not call, did not flicker, did not ask. It simply rested there, steady as a heartbeat, a reminder of the rhythm he had internalized. Rick sat, hands brushing the grass, listening not for wonder but for understanding. He recognized that the presence had never been a destination. It had been a mirror, reflecting what he could bring to the world through patience, attention, and gentle endurance. Elia joined him occasionally, now more comfortable in his own rhythm. They shared the quiet without words, each learning that the act of presence itself was enough. The shimmer had taught Rick to walk gently between worlds, and now it was teaching him to carry the same gentleness across the world that had always seemed ordinary. He began to notice the smallest cracks where light could enter, the soft smile of a stranger, the pause between a question and an answer, the tiny gestures of care that might otherwise go unseen. Rick understood, finally, that this was the culmination of all the shimmer had asked of him. The crossings, the whispers, the meadows, the rivers, they had prepared him not to conquer, not to escape, but to hold, to stay, to be present in ways that radiated outward. Each quiet act, each patient breath, each attentive glance became a reflection of the shimmer's pulse, carried not through doors or thresholds, but through the life he chose to live every day. He rose slowly, feeling the weight and grace of all he had learned. The stars were faint now, the garden still and patient, the shimmer resting in its quiet place. Rick smiled softly, knowing that the bond was no longer something he pursued. It was something he embodied. He walked toward home, the rhythm of presence flowing through him, and in that steady movement he carried the shimmer into every corner of his world. And somewhere he's still out there, napping in the sun. Even as days grew longer and the seasons shifted, Rick found that the shimmer's influence had settled deep into the quiet currents of his life. He no longer thought of it as a doorway to other worlds. It was a pulse within him, a rhythm that guided the way he observed, listened, and responded to the world around him. The streets he walked, the corners he lingered near, even the spaces between people's words carried the faint echo of what he had learned. Presence, patience, and the gentle courage to stay. Elia continued to move alongside him, sometimes in silence, sometimes with shared murmurs of understanding. They didn't need to speak about the shimmer or the lessons it had taught. It had transformed from an external mystery into an internal compass, a living pulse shaping the way they moved through the ordinary. Rick watched the boy notice subtle rhythms, the pause before a reply, the curve of a neighbor's smile, the fleeting tremor of someone carrying unspoken burdens. And in that noticing, Rick saw the bond extend beyond himself, a quiet inheritance of attention, steadiness, and care. He returned often to the garden at dusk, lingering where the shimmer had first appeared. It no longer rippled or beckoned. It rested, a faint glow at the edge of perception, like a heartbeat folded into the air itself. Rick would trace the outlines of the grass, close his eyes, and feel the continuity of all he had carried. The meadows, the silver rivers, the pale groves, and the tender presences of those he had held in his attention. The shimmer had taught him that the true journey was not through landscapes or thresholds, but through acts of care and awareness that touched others without intrusion or demand. At school, Rick began noticing small spaces where the shimmer's lessons could guide him. A student faltering in the hallway, a teacher bending too far under the weight of expectation, a friend hesitating on the edge of trust. Each moment became an opportunity to extend the rhythm he had learned. He no longer moved with urgency or expectation. He moved with the quiet patience of someone who had been guided, who had listened deeply, and who understood that presence could ripple outward in ways unseen but deeply felt. Even at home, Rick's steps carried the shimmer's legacy. Silence, once empty, was now filled with attentive breathing. Words, once hurried, were now measured, offering room for others' pauses. And in the spaces between moments, he found himself aligned with the pulse of the shimmer, steady, calm, and unhurried. It was not an external force anymore. It was a living part of him, threading through every choice gesture and quiet act of care. He paused one evening, lantern in hand, looking back at the garden one final time. The shimmer's faint glow lingered at the edge of his awareness, steady, patient, a mirror of all he had become. He smiled softly, feeling the weight of the journey settle gently within him. He had learned to carry light without grasping it, to hold presence without demanding, to guide without leading, and to endure without breaking. The shimmer had been a doorway, a teacher and a companion, but above all it had been a mirror, reflecting the capacity to live fully in attentiveness, patience and quiet courage, and somewhere he's still out there, napping in the sun. Rick walked through the garden as twilight settled, the sky washed in muted purples and soft golds. The shimmer no longer called with urgency, no longer pulsed with a curiosity that demanded crossing. It rested, a quiet presence folded into the air, like a memory that had learned to breathe. He traced the familiar edges of grass with his fingertips, feeling the pulse that had become part of him. Steady, patient and unhurried, Elia followed quietly, lantern light casting gentle shadows across the ground. They didn't speak, nor did they need to. The garden itself seemed to hold the rhythm between them, a living measure of presence that had been taught through months of crossings, whispers, and quiet endurance. Rick understood now that the shimmer had never been about moving through worlds or discovering landscapes. It had been about carrying light, patience, and care wherever one could. At home, at school, in fleeting moments of silence, Rick began to notice the subtle reflections of what he had learned. A classmate's hesitant glance could be met with attention instead of distraction. A parent's quiet worry could be met with calm steadiness rather than words. A friend's unspoken doubt could be held gently, without expectation or demand. Each small act, each patient breath became a ripple, quietly echoing the lessons of the shimmer. The garden seemed to settle around him that evening, as if acknowledging the rhythm he had cultivated. The faint glow of the shimmer reflected in his chest, not external now, but internalized, a living pulse guiding each careful step. Rick understood fully that the journey had never been about what he could see or where he could go, but about what he could carry. Presence, patience, listening, and quiet courage, threaded into every interaction, every moment of attention, every pause held for someone else. He stood slowly, lantern in hand, and let his gaze sweep over the familiar horizon. The shimmer remained, faint and steady, not calling, not demanding. It was enough that it existed, and that he had learned to carry its lessons. Rick felt the weight of the journey settle into him, a soft exhale of understanding. He had crossed countless thresholds, yet the most important crossing had always been within, from curiosity to patience, from wonder to enduring care, from seeking to presence. Rick began to walk back, each step measured, intentional, and filled with quiet confidence. Elia matched his pace, and together they moved through the garden, through the twilight, carrying the shimmer's pulse into the spaces they inhabited. The world now felt full in a way it had never been, vibrant not through spectacle but through steady, gentle attention. And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. Rick moved through the garden in the soft hush of early night, the sky stretched wide above him, deep indigo fading to silver at the horizon. The shimmer no longer demanded attention, no longer called him forward with urgency. It rested faintly, as if it had become part of the world itself, existing quietly at the edge of perception. Rick's hands brushed the tips of grass, feeling the subtle vibration that had travelled with him all these months. It was no longer a portal to distant meadows or silver rivers. It was a rhythm he carried within him, steady and constant. Elia followed a step behind, lantern light, swaying gently, reflecting off the dew. Neither spoke. Words had become unnecessary. The rhythm of presence that the shimmer had taught Rick now stretched between them, an unspoken bond of attention, care, and patience. Rick understood fully that the journey had always been about carrying light rather than seeking it, a quiet inheritance threaded through the ways one observes, listens, and simply exists alongside others. The city beyond the garden hummed softly, distant and muted, yet Rick felt the pulse of all those unnoticed moments, the flicker of a neighbour's smile, the hesitation of a classmate in the hallway, the tremor of someone carrying unseen weight. Each one was an opportunity to extend the quiet lessons of the shimmer, to hold space with patient steadiness, to create threads of light that could ripple without demanding notice. Rick let the lantern glow softly fall over the familiar shapes of the garden. The shimmer pulsed faintly in response, a reflection rather than a call. He traced the edges of the grass with his fingers, breathing in the rhythm he had nurtured for so long. It was not about crossing into worlds anymore. It was about being fully present in this one. The lessons of patience, listening, and quiet courage had taken root within him, shaping each gesture, each glance, each breath. He rose slowly, and the neighbour boy rose beside him. Together, they walked through the garden with measured steps, carrying the shimmer's pulse into every quiet corner. The glow of the lantern, the deepening night, the rhythm of presence threading between them, all of it seemed to affirm a truth Rick had come to know deeply. The shimmer had never been a destination nor a door to adventure. It had been a guide toward living fully, tenderly and attentively. Rick paused once more at the garden gate, looking back at the faint glow where the shimmer rested. He understood that the bond would always remain, not as a portal, but as a pulse woven into the way he moved, thought, and listened. And with a soft exhale, he stepped forward into the world he had learned to inhabit, carrying light wherever he went. And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. Rick walked slowly through the garden one final time, letting the night settle around him like a soft blanket. The shimmer pulsed faintly at the edge of the grass, steady, patient, and calm. He no longer needed to cross into other worlds to learn its lessons. They had taken root inside him, shaping the way he moved, listened, and simply existed. Each breath he drew, each step he took, carried the quiet rhythm of presence, patience, and gentle courage that had guided him from the very first crossing. Elia walked beside him, lantern flickering softly, and for a long while neither spoke. The garden was alive with subtle motion, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the city, the faint pulse of the shimmer. But Rick felt no urgency, no longing for adventure. He understood that the true crossing had always been within himself, from curiosity to patience, from wonder to enduring care, from seeking to being. He paused at the familiar patch of grass where he had first knelt months ago, fingertips tracing the blades lightly. Memories of violet meadows, silver rivers, and glowing groves brushed past him, not as distant places to visit, but as reflections of the growth he had carried into his life. The lessons of the shimmer had extended outward, touching Aaliyah, his family, classmates, and neighbors, weaving quiet threads of presence through spaces that might otherwise have remained unnoticed. Rick rose slowly. The weight of the journey settled gently into his chest. The shimmer's pulse echoed softly within him, a quiet affirmation that he had learned what it meant to hold light without grasping it, to guide without leading, to endure without breaking. He smiled faintly, understanding that the shimmer would always exist, not as a portal or a call, but as a living rhythm within the world and within himself. As he stepped through the garden gate, Elia at his side, Rick felt the pulse of the shimmer blend with the rhythm of the world around him, the hum of distant traffic, the whisper of wind in the trees, the steady beat of his own heart. Presence, patience, listening, and quiet courage threaded through every gesture, every glance, every breath. The journey had not ended. It had become a way of being. And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.